learning to live the Jesus way. And when we were singing that song, These Are the Days, well, it's the days of Ezekiel too, right? This is the first verse that gets the name. But the song is declaring, right, that all of these stories, all these things from the past, we're still living in that story. We're still living in that world where we're declaring that, look, you can see what God is doing. You can see who God is and what God's Spirit is doing among God's people. In the same way, when we come to the Gospels and we read about Jesus teaching and calling disciples and all of that, while it is true that Jesus was doing and saying those things 2,000 years ago, it is also true that He is still speaking to us today, right? He's still calling to us and teaching us through the Gospels, through His Scriptures. And so we're thinking about this call that Jesus makes to follow Him, and we'll get there in just a little while. But first, I want to start this morning in Luke chapter 6. It's Luke's Sermon on the Plain. Luke chapter 6 starts in verse 20, goes on down through the end of the chapter. But I want to focus only on one thing that Jesus said in this Sermon on the Plain. It's a question He also asked in Matthew, but later on, it's not in the Sermon on the Mount. But it's this question that is it's a metaphor, it's a rhetorical question. It's, in a way, an easy one to answer. Luke chapter 6, verse 39, He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? Now, that question is pretty straightforward, and the answer to that question, those two questions, are no and then yes, right? No, a blind man can't lead a blind man, and yes, the outcome will not be good for them if they are not able to see and are being led around or trying to lead someone else along. To be led by someone who can't see is to be led to ruin. And to try to lead someone when you can't see is an exercise of futility. So understood, Jesus. We get it. The blind can't lead a blind man. The guy who makes, his 30-second Facebook video and is like, hey, $100 for my investing course and you'll make $10 million in a year. The blind can't lead the blind. The marriage self-help author who has written 13 best-selling books on marriage and is on his 4th or 5th marriage. The blind can't lead the blind. The politician who 5 years ago or 10 years ago vehemently opposed this particular policy, and pick whatever politician, but then it was popular then to vehemently oppose it, and now staunchly advocates for it, right? Because it's popular now. The blind can't lead the blind. The pastor who predicts the end of the world in 2025 and also predicted the end of the world in 2020 and 2012 and Y2K. The blind can't lead the blind. All of that is good and well and makes sense to us. The problem is that in this parable, which is what Luke calls it, it's a one-line parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? A two-part, one-question a parable. In this parable, Jesus forces us to grapple with the next logical question. See, that's the thing about parables, however small, is there's something there that you have to just kind of chew on and contemplate to really begin to get the full meaning of the question. And we get the rhetorical, a blind person can't lead a blind person and they're going to both fall into the pit if they try it. We get that, but there's another question, and the question is, if the blind can't lead the blind, then who can see? See, I have to start asking myself the question, can I see? And if I can't see, then who am I going to look to lead me? Can the blind lead the blind? No, but if the blind can't lead the blind, then who can see? That's the question. At the risk of answering part of the question too quickly, I'm just going to assume that you are ready to confess today that you're blind. I'm ready to confess today that I am blind. I know myself well enough to know that left alone, I'm not going to make the right choice. I'm not going to be a perfect person, and I don't mean to be rude, but I think I know you well enough to know that too. We understand that we have come today to confess not our greatness, but instead that we wholeheartedly agree with the psalmist who says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They're corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one." And I would put myself firmly in that group, as I trust you also would put yourself in that group. The Apostle Paul, for example, in Romans, puts us in that group. That we've all turned aside, that none are righteous, no, not one. So this means then that in that little parable, "Can the blind lead the blind?" Jesus first calls us to confront the reality of our own blindness. But again, that doesn't answer this question. If the blind can't lead the blind, then who can see? Maybe we could put it even more powerfully. If the blind can't lead the blind and I'm blind, then who can see to lead me? That's the question. And here's this part of Jesus' teachings that completely offends modern cultural sensibilities. Because Jesus answers this question throughout all of his teachings and throughout his life by positioning himself as the only person who can see. And that, listen, if you don't believe that Jesus is who Jesus claimed to be, how could that not offend you? How could you not say, what an arrogant claim for a person to make that everybody in the world is blind, but only they can see? It's an outrageous claim, an arrogant claim from the world's perspective. For Jesus to say something like this, Thomas in John 14 says to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" He's talking about, Jesus has just said, don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, all of that. He said, well, I get that, but I don't know where you're going. How do we know the way to get to that place? And Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." I mean, you read that level of certainty, that level of exclusivity, if you will. Jesus doesn't leave much there for us to question. He says, "I am the path to a meaningful life. I am the very truth of God revealed to human beings. I am the objective standard of what is true. I am the source of life itself, and no one comes to the Father except through me." That's about as bold a claim, as absolute a claim as a person can make. Philip, I love Philip, he says, "Lord, show us the Father." He says, "If you'd known me, you would also know my Father." Then Philip says, "Lord, show us the Father. That'll be enough for us." And Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" Or take this passage from John chapter 8, verse 12, another one of Jesus' "I am" statements. Jesus spoke to them saying, "I am the light of the world." If you don't believe that Jesus is who he says that he is, who he said he was, then yeah, that is an offensive claim. I am the source of light for the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. In other words, in no uncertain terms, Jesus positions himself, teaches us that we are blind and that only he is capable of providing us with a path to follow in life that leads away from the pit, that leads away from destruction and leads away from dissatisfaction and leads away from all of the things that we struggle with, a path to life. And that's a difficult thing for us to hear, that Jesus claims that path is only accessible by learning to follow him. This morning, I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you about one of Jesus's, one of the core ways the gospel presents Jesus. Now, it's not the only way. We're going to talk about Jesus this morning as the rabbi, the teacher. But this is obviously not the extent of Jesus' identity. He's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He's the suffering servant that we think about from Isaiah 52 and 53. He's the king. He's all of these different things. But sometimes we might lose sight on exactly the way that Jesus was relating to his disciples in the story of the Gospels and how Jesus can relate to you and me in our lives. When we think about this idea, this Jewish custom of these rabbis that were these itinerant preachers, they would travel and teach, and they would have followers who would be, their band of disciples that would go with them wherever they went, and they would, some of them would be younger, some would be older, whatever the case might be. But sometimes we're hearing the word rabbi, and it's translated into English as teacher. That's true because rabbis did a lot of teaching, but it might be a little bit, it might say too little, because it kind of sounds like the rabbi would sit his students down and would give them a lesson, meet me 8:30 to 10:30 Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you'll have your class, and then come back and there'll be tests and so forth, like a kind of a college professor. But that's not the way that the rabbis operated in Jesus' day, and it's not how Jesus operated either. The rabbis would come from various walks of life. Some of them were skilled in a trade. Others were, more academics. There were various different people that were rabbis. But these students, these young men, would grow up and they would learn the first 5 books of the Bible. They would learn the Old Testament. And if you were really excelling, you would try to send in like an application to the rabbis and say, please, I want to be a follower of this guy because his life and his teaching, I want to be shaped by that person. So the best and the brightest would try to find a rabbi, and maybe the rabbi would say, well, can you quote for me from the scroll of Isaiah that starts like this? He has appointed me, and then it would be up to them to fill out the rest of that chapter to kind of prove that they were worthy to follow their rabbi. And there would be a very exclusive circle. At any rate, the Jewish rabbis, they would not merely teach about Jewish law or religious law. Really, it was about calling disciples to their way of life, that they were literally living with these disciples and shaping the way, not just that they understood the law of God or the Scriptures, but how they mastered life and understood what it meant from their perspective to live life well. As John Mark Comer in his book Practicing the Way puts it, to follow a rabbi meant that class was life. Your whole life was being enrolled in this person's school. And along comes Jesus, and he has a mastery over life. I mean, he's got a mastery over the elements, for crying out loud, not just life. But along comes Jesus, and rather than receiving kind of applications from an elite select students who show the greatest prowess for public speaking and rhetorical skills and mastery of the law and all of that. Jesus comes along and walks to the docks and finds 4 fishermen and says, "Come, follow me." Jesus offers them an open invitation as opposed to a practice that would have been much more closed, and it would have been the balance in the other side of things of, can I please come? Jesus says, I want you. Come, follow me. And Peter and Andrew are out there with their nets, and they say, okay, let's go. And Jesus comes to a tax collector named Matthew, Levi, and says, come, follow me. And he's calling them not simply to know some truths that he's going to teach them, but he's calling them to a way of life. He's calling them to what discipleship really is. Discipleship is this word that we use to describe a rabbi's followers, or they use to describe a rabbi's followers. It's a word that we hear a lot, but what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, look at Matthew 4 and the calling of the fishermen. From that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. What was it that Peter and Andrew were being summoned into? They were being summoned to learn a new way of life. No, better yet. Maybe we can picture it like this. They were called to apprentice under Jesus to learn a new way of life. Not every field has apprenticeships. You can go to college and you can hear lectures about various subjects, and then you can kind of just go start a job. But there are certain fields that rely heavily on an apprenticeship aspect, if not exclusively apprentice-based. You think about some of the trades, and you have an electrician or someone who has an apprentice, and he's teaching them how to do things, and he's really focused on not just how can I make sure you understand this book, but how can I teach you how to do things. In the medical profession, there's the residency aspect of becoming a doctor that is moving beyond just the studying, but it's having some supervision and some mentorship in how to actually do what needs to be done. And we can talk about all kinds of things. For my own part, I went to college for several years. I got my bachelor's and then my master's and all that. But I also had these internships where, like the summer that I was at Sarah's home church, actually, I spent the whole summer with their preacher, and we sat down for like 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, and he would just start talking, and I would ask questions, and he'd be saying, okay, when it's time to do a funeral, this is the kinds of things that we're looking for. Or he would say, I want you to go tomorrow, and I want you to write a funeral for this kind of person. I don't know, it's just an exercise, right? Okay, we come back the next day. I see how you did that, but maybe we should think about doing this next time, right? I can tell you, I learned a lot more from him than I did from my classes, right? Because we're actually hands-on doing the thing together. Can you imagine trying to teach a child how to ride a bike, for example, purely by giving them a lecture about how the bike works? Okay, so you need to get on, right? And let me give you a little diagram. This is how it's done, You got to get the kid on the bike, right? And help them learn how to navigate. You've got to basically nearly be riding the bike with them, right? And then there comes that moment where they're off on their own. But Jesus makes this call to discipleship that is about learning to live with Jesus and to have your whole life be directed by Jesus in an apprenticeship relationship, where you do what he does, where you learn to think like he thinks, where you learn to talk like he talks. The disciples who are following Jesus, they're saying to Jesus, Lord, after they listen to him pray, Luke says, they come up to him and say, Lord, teach us how to pray. What are they saying? They're saying, we want to be more like you. How do we become more like you, Jesus? We're living with you. Shape us, mold us, teach us, show us. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus is in John chapter 10, I skipped a verse. In John chapter 10, Jesus tells us that part of the reason that he came into the world is that we might learn to have life and have it abundantly, have it to the full, have it to the max. That Jesus is teaching us not just the truth about eternal life, but he's helping guide us into really learning how to live well now. Learning how to have a character that is refined and is growing more and more honorable, more and more holy. Learning how to overcome the anxiety that plagues us as we look out at the many things that go on in our world, in our workplace, in our team, in our family. Learning how to grow as people who live in this world. How do you do that? You do that only by living with Jesus, by imitating him, by being repeatedly corrected by him, by being his apprentice. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus makes a call to anyone, gives a teaching to anyone. Unlike maybe the closed rabbinical schools, Jesus offers an open invitation and calling to the crowd to him with his disciples. Notice this, calling the crowd to him with his disciples. In the Gospels, there's like the disciples in the crowd, the people that are apprenticing under Jesus, and the people that are just onlooking and just saying, wonder what this Jesus guy is like. Is it possible that there are many people who identify as Christians, but who are really more interested in onlooking than being people that are shaped daily under Jesus' training and tutelage, if you will? Is it possible that we today need to hear this call? If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. I just want to tell you this morning, want to remind myself that you are anyone and that you are whoever. I am anyone. I am whoever. That this call that Jesus is making in Mark and makes throughout the Gospels is a call for all people to learn to live the good life by apprenticing under him, by being his disciple. To do what he did, to fail, to be corrected, to learn, to get back up, to begin to think and speak and act like Jesus. I want to take you back to our parable. Our parable is, can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into the pit? And the answer is, yes, we understand. No and yes. But it's the next verse that Jesus speaks in Luke 6 that really is the heart of what we're saying today. Jesus goes on and says, a disciple, a follower, an apprentice, is not above his rabbi, his teacher. But everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Now, think about that for a second. What Jesus does not say is that a disciple will learn to know the things his teacher knows. He says that a disciple will become like the teacher. We're not called to earn our salvation, you know that. But we are called to gratefully accept the training of Jesus, the way of life that Jesus models and teaches, not as a means for us earning our way to heaven, but as a means of tasting the gift of the good life in the here and now. Listen again to the call of Jesus in Matthew 11:28 through 30, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And we say, "Wonderful, give me that rest. I want that rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." This rest for the soul that we all crave, that we're all longing for, it's something that can come to us as an act of grace and peace and all of that, but it comes with a yoke. Like an ox, we are yoked by the master and steered through the field, led in a particular way of being and living. And notice that Jesus says, "You will find rest for your souls." In other words, he's saying, I know the way, I know the path. Now let me drive you there. In 1 John chapter 2, John tells us, "Whoever says, 'I know him,' I know Jesus, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him." Okay, this is important then, right? By this we may know that we are in him. Oh no, my highlighter just didn't quite work. But whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. What's he saying? He's saying whoever's following must be an apprentice, not just an onlooker, someone who is being shaped in character, in deed, and thought by Jesus. So in future Sundays, we're going to be looking at some practical ways about how that can take place in our lives. How do we live out that calling, and what's it cost, and what's at stake, and some of those kinds of things. But today, I just want you to simply meditate on whether or not your core identity, or a key part of your core identity, is shaped around this idea of being an apprentice to Jesus, of being a disciple, someone who is watching and listening and imitating and sharing. It's not about being a super Christian, as though it's like there's the Christians here and there's the disciples over here. This is Jesus' call to anyone, to whoever follows me. It's not about being perfect either. It's about the basic orientation of the soul. Apprenticeship is not about perfection. If a student was perfect, there would be no need for the teacher. Apprenticeship is about giving your best, giving your effort, and then realizing all the ways that your best is falling short. And listening to Jesus, the master teacher, as he shows, as he explains, as he shapes, as he picks up and dusts you off. This morning, what I really want to ask you, if you're someone who would identify themselves as a believer in Jesus, but you really haven't made the commitment to follow Jesus in your daily life, today is a great day to discover anew the gift of the gospel. Because I think I know something about you, if that's you. I know that you know a lot of Christian jargon about church and Jesus and salvation and all of that. But I probably know that within you there still resides a deep sense of restlessness, a deep sense of confusion and anxiety over what it means to live and what it means to live well. And maybe that's because you have kind of a foot here in the Jesus camp, but you're really just mostly trying to look on while you go your own way. Today's a great day to ask for prayers that you might be recommitted to that end. And if you've not been a believer, by the way, I don't mean you got to come up here. Just find a Christian friend that you know around in this building. Talk to them. Call somebody afterwards. Text somebody. Whatever the case is, you're welcome to come, but that's not the goal of the sermon. The second thing is, if you're not a believer in Jesus, but you're interested in following Jesus now, you're coming to faith, I just want you to know two things. First of all, you will find rest for your soul if you follow Jesus. But I also want to tell you, you get that rest by taking his yoke upon you, by submitting willfully that I don't know where I'm going, I'm blind, but I'm going to choose this day to follow Jesus because he's the only one that can see, and he will lead me to rest and life forever. And if that's you this morning, you want to follow Jesus, maybe you're ready to be immersed into Christ, we want to invite you to come as we stand and sing.